Friday Forum, Oregon's premier public affairs forum. I'm Jim Zarin at my final Friday Forum as City Club President to welcome you all, those of you here at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB or KBPS radio or watching on cable television. Thank you for joining us for this week's Friday Forum on this, the 19th of June, 2009. Today we welcome a senior member of Oregon's congressional delegation who will discuss his views on proposals for so-called cap-and-trade system approaches to addressing climate change. He also will speak a little about the outlook for federal funding for transportation and other significant matters facing Congress and the nation. But first, some announcements. In consideration of those sitting close to you and those in our radio and television audiences, I ask everybody in the room, if you haven't already done so, to please turn off your cell phones or other devices that may make noise. As always, we express our appreciation to our Friday Forum corporate sponsors, without whose generous financial support these time-honored City Club Friday Forum luncheons would not be possible. Our initial corporate sponsors for this quarter are the law firm of Stoll Reeves LLP and the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. We thank them both for their support. And if your company or firm would like to be a sponsor of our Friday Forums or of our nationally recognized citizen-driven research program, please contact City Club staff at the back of the room or call the club office. City Club's popular Citizen Salon Dinner and Discussion Series continues next Thursday night on June 25th with the dinner topic, Portland's Bridges to the Future, Pragmatism versus Inspiration. Hear and discuss what urban design critic and Portland Spaces magazine editor-in-chief Randy Gregg, who will be the guest provocateur at the dinner, has to say about the new bridges being proposed for construction across the Columbia and Willamette Rivers and why, in his opinion, it is so important that we get the designs for these bridges right. To make a reservation for this Citizen Salon dinner and to learn about other such dinners coming up later this summer, go to the City Club website, watch the club's bulletin, or contact the club office. If you are a City Club member and have not yet made your reservation for this year's annual membership meeting set for next Tuesday, that's next Tuesday, June 23rd, excuse me, be aware that today is the deadline to do so. This year, unlike in prior years, the annual meeting will be held in an evening and on a Tuesday from 5:30 to 8, rather than here at the Friday Forum, and will be held at the EcoTrust building in the Pearl District rather than here at the Governor Hotel. Now, the event will include our regular annual business meeting of members, during which we will vote on a slate of officers and board members for next year, and will recognize members of the club who have made contributions to the club and the community. But the second half of the meeting this year will be a group discussion and computerized keypad voting on significant questions about the club and its future that have arisen during our strategic planning process during this past year. Should be an interesting and fun event. But to participate, you have to make a reservation, and to do that on time, you have to do so before 5 o'clock today. So if you're an interested but recalcitrant club member, please call the club office by 5 o'clock to make sure your reservation is received and accounted for. The night after our annual meeting, on Wednesday 24th, you can sit down with Oregon's new Attorney General, John Kroger, when he joins the club's Citizens Read book group discussion of his book, Convictions. The book is for sale at the back of the room. Although this event is free, a reservation is required, so contact the club office if you'd like to attend. And at next week's Friday Forum on June 26th, that same Attorney General John Kroger will be our speaker, where he will present a progress report on his first 6 months of occupancy of the Office of Attorney General. That's next week here at the Friday Forum. And now to today's program. We in this country, and indeed people all over the world, are starting to come to grips with the fact that we are collectively facing challenges of new and immense scope and complexity. One such challenge is climate change. Another is how to pay for investments in aging infrastructure, such as highways, and to make investments in transit systems, all to move goods and people. By virtue of his status as the Dean of Oregon's delegation to the U.S. House of Representatives and his own independent and critical thinking, our speaker is an outspoken and veteran participant in discussions of these kinds of important issues. On climate change, for example, he parts with many in his own party by expressing concern, if not outright opposition, to so-called cap-and-trade systems. He'll have a lot more to say about that. As many of you know, the basic idea of cap-and-trade systems is for the government to allocate to each program participant the right to emit a certain amount of identified pollutants, that's the cap part, and then for those participants to be allowed to sell any right to pollute that they do not use, called a credit, to other participants who have a need or desire to emit beyond their own maximum, and that's the trade part. This kind of cap-and-trade approach is widely advocated, including by many here in Oregon, and it is being used regionally in New England and also in Europe. But is it working? Is it a solution that we in Oregon should pursue, or should it be pursued on a multi-state regional basis, or nationally, which many advocate is the scale at which it must be implemented in order to be successful? Well, our speaker has his own critical views, and they will be provocative for us to hear. And on the infrastructure issue, our speaker also brings to perspective that of a senior member of the U.S. House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and of real significance for all of us in Oregon as chair of the Highways and Transit Subcommittee of that House committee. Not only do these positions give him real insights about and influence on where federal dollars for things like highways and transit systems flow and will flow, but they have resulted in him also being well-versed in the historic challenge we now face in generating the revenues necessary to continue federal funding for such programs. We need to listen carefully to what he'll say about this. So, as mentioned, our speaker is the longest-serving member of the current House delegation in Oregon, having been first elected to Congress in 1986. He represents Benton, Coos, Curry, Douglas, Josephine, Lane, and Lynn counties in southwest Oregon. Our speaker has refused to accept congressional pay raises while the federal government is deficit spending. Instead, he has turned his pay raises into scholarships at 5 community colleges in southwest Oregon, and by the end of this year, he will have contributed in this way over $300,000 in after-tax salary to fund 187 scholarships, something that he describes as being among his proudest accomplishments. Please help me welcome today, for what he and I think is the 4th or 5th time at this microphone, the representative of Oregon's 4th Congressional District, the Honorable Peter DeFazio. Congressman?
Thanks. It's great to be home and great to be back at the City Club. As he mentioned, I am chair of the Surface Transportation Subcommittee, and I'm just finishing a 2.5-year project to totally overhaul, revamp our transportation policy and the Department of Transportation and move us from a system that's just a little iterative of what Dwight David Eisenhower started with the National Highway System in the 50s to a plan and to deliver on a 21st century transportation infrastructure for America. I'll get to that a little bit at the end of my speech and certainly be happy to entertain questions. Yesterday, we set a record in Washington, not one that is going to get anybody very excited, but we cast more votes than any other day in the history of the House of Representatives, 53. We were trapped on the floor for 8 hours. We voted on some amendments 3 times. The Republicans were in a bad mood. And I got up very early this morning to get here, and United tortured me, but I made it. So please cut me a little slack. There are people in this room who are not old enough to remember that there was a time in America when our rivers caught fire. The Cuyahoga River, 1969. There's others who may not remember that the Willamette River was once an open sewer in the late 1960s. And in response to this national problem, Congress passed the Clean Water Act in 1972. And it set up a regulatory scheme to prohibit unauthorized discharges of pollution into our waterways. The approach was very straightforward. We went out and inventoried the pollution. We gave people schedules and targets, and then we made them buy permits, and then we monitored them, and if they didn't meet the permits, we fined the heck out of them. And it worked. One of the most successful environmental programs in the history of the United States. There are certainly new challenges in clean water now, but the Clean Water Act is alive and well, and it's evolving to deal now with non-point source pollution threats and concerns. So it's still a very viable act. But today, we face the greatest environmental challenge of all time, a problem that's global in nature, but with the potential for dire and unpredictable regional and local impacts. Climate change. Now, since the beginning of the industrial era, the United States has emitted far more greenhouse gases than any other country. I mean, today, on an annual basis, we're number 2 behind China. But during the 8 dark years of the Bush administration, we had a government that refused to acknowledge that there was a problem with greenhouse gases and climate change, and certainly didn't take any leadership in resolving the issue. Well, all that changed with Barack Obama. Now we are finally confronting the problem. Just this week, the Obama administration released a report. The United States Global Change Research Program, joint scientific venture of 13 federal agencies, published a 200-page report warning that the U.S. will not be able to stop some climate changes even with immediate and dramatic action. So this is a very real problem. I'm not here to give Al Gore's inconvenient truth presentation, but because of my outspoken opposition to cap and trade, there's been some confusion about my views on global warming. I want to make it clear. I am now, and have been for a number of years, convinced by the science global warming is happening, human activity is substantially responsible for rising temperatures, and the United States of America must take immediate and effective action and lead the world in dealing with this problem. Basically, we've got 3 options. You've got the Clean Water Act model. We could regulate. Cap, regulate, reduce, monitor. There's some who are proposing a carbon tax. And then we have the market-based cap and trade. I'm going to spend a good deal of time on cap and trade and then discuss what I think is a more viable alternative. You had a brief discussion here of how cap and trade works. You set a cap. The government then gives the participants allowances to pollute up to the established cap, and the participants may buy and sell, trade these in the market to meet their targets. In theory, emissions will drop as we issue fewer allowances, but there's a problem with that, particularly in this bill, and I'll get to that later. There's also another component that's less known, and it's called offsets. And offsets are really the crux of my most dire concerns about where this cap and trade would lead us and would lead the world. There is already widespread, there's documentation of widespread abuse in offset projects approved under something which Kyoto established and Europe is using and which we would mimic, called the Clean Development Mechanism. I'll digress here for a moment. It's 12 years ago I came here and I gave a speech against something that was then very au courant. Everybody was really excited about it. It was a great new thing. Natural Resources Defense Council, Wall Street, big business all thought this was the way to solve major problems in this country. It was called energy deregulation. And I came here as one of the very few in the House of Representatives who voted against Ed Markey's proposal to deregulate energy and predicted what a disaster it would be. I wish I'd been wrong. It was an extraordinary disaster. In 2 years in California, they went from $30 a megawatt hour average to $300 a megawatt hour average, and they had spikes at $1,900 a megawatt hour, and the lights kept going out. Not a great thing. But there was a lot of money to be made, and Enron made a lot of money by manipulating the market. Now, they're gone, Enron's gone, but their legacy actually lives on. We're paying $1 billion. We've paid $1 billion more so far in the Northwest since Enron and energy deregulation unnecessarily for our power here. That money could be a little bit better spent than for these inflated contracts that were entered into at that time that couldn't be rolled back. Now, Ed Markey, the father of energy deregulation in the House, and Henry Waxman have taken a page from the Enron book, and that page is cap and trade. So far as anyone can tell, the first major and persistent proponents of cap and trade were Enron. They spent millions and hundreds of hours lobbying the Clinton administration in the 90s for a market-based approach to deal with carbon emissions. There was a private internal memo written by Enron executive Jeff Palmisano in 1997 stated the Kyoto Protocol Treaty and a cap and trade system would be good for Enron stock, and went on to predict that under an underregulated market would do more to promote Enron's business than will almost any other regulatory initiative outside of restructuring, that is, deregulating, energy and natural gas industries in Europe and the United States. Enron's gone, but the excitement lives on Wall Street for their successors or would-be successors. Here's a quote from Chris Leeds, head of emissions trading at Merrill Lynch. Carbon could become one of the fastest-growing markets ever, with volumes comparable to credit derivatives inside of a decade. Credit derivatives? Anybody remember that? This is another quote from Simon Glossop, founder of a hedge fund designed to track and manipulate movements of carbon pricing. Carbon has now become an investable asset class in its own right instead of a compliance tool. The volatility around the market's policy risk is actually good for us from an investor point of view, so we encourage it. Of course, it's not good for us as consumers and many other interests, or those who are seriously concerned about carbon emissions. So Europe implemented a system, 3-4 years ago, and they've basically the downturn in the economy has changed things a little bit. But for the first 2 years, they emitted more carbon, and they added $60 billion of costs trading carbon. So they emitted more carbon and spent $60 billion to do that. It worked after a fashion because there are people who got rich on the trading. We don't have their last year numbers. Their estimates, it might be down a little, but that wouldn't be due to cap and trade. It's probably due to the tanked economy because actually our emissions last year were down 2.8%, which is the biggest drop in 30 years in the United States. And of course, we haven't adopted any changes in policy. It's just merely because so many plants have been shut down, people are traveling less. So Europe has a deregulated carbon market. So anybody can buy, sell, trade allowances, which include speculators, hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds. And that's why Wall Street is so excited about this proposal, the Markey-Waxman bill. Now, that bill would create a very thinly regulated market. We don't have a really great track record of regulating derivatives and other exotic instruments in this country. The president has proposed something that hopefully would be adopted. It should be stronger than what he proposed, but it would be a start. But it would not stop this kind of gaming in energy markets. And, they also in Europe have the offset provision. And as I mentioned earlier, offsets allow polluters to forego any meaningful change in behavior by investing in projects in developing countries. Now, there are some good offsets out there that are legitimate, but most studies show, and here's a report by David Victor, head of Stanford University's Energy and Sustainable Development Program, between 1/3 and 2/3 of offsets used in the European cap and trade do not represent emissions cuts. So, offsets are a little abstract. Let me try and give you a couple of examples that are not atypical. In China and India, they produce a lot of refrigerants. It's called HFC 22. There's a horrible byproduct called HFC 23, which is an unbelievably powerful greenhouse gas, 12,000 times worse than regular carbon. So in the U.S. or Europe or Japan or anywhere else where we produce refrigerants, our laws require that byproduct be destroyed right there. Well, the Chinese don't do that. They collect it, they pipe it to another plant, and that plant then puts up a for sale sign. And the way it works is Deutsche Bank has entered into an agreement with these Chinese companies who are storing this really bad greenhouse gas, which costs about $1 a ton to dispose of. Deutsche Bank has been, I don't know what they're doing now and what kind of contracts they're locked into, but as of last year was paying $8 a ton to buy the destruction of those greenhouse gases. So the Chinese make $7 a ton destroying it. And then Deutsche Bank takes the credits, which are offsets for destroying this horrible gas, which should have been destroyed in the process, to Europe and sells them to European companies that don't want to cut their emissions for $20 a ton. Now, this is an offset, and that's just one abusive example. It would cost, they estimate, if all the Chinese and Indian companies installed the proper equipment to destroy the gas. So it cost about $157 million. But last year they got paid $7.3 billion to destroy the gas. So why would they do that? That's an offset. So those European companies don't have to meet their caps because they bought the destruction of the gas, which is a byproduct, in India. So there's no net decrease in carbon. That's why carbon emissions are up in Europe. Now, I'll give one more example because there are, a lot of environmental groups think this is how we're going to save the rainforests because they really expect that U.S. companies will go down and invest in offsets by saving the rainforest in Amazon or Brazil. But that may not be the most profitable thing going on down there. First off, obviously, Brazil has some of the strongest environmental laws in the world, but there's an unbelievable amount of disregard of those laws and illegal logging, and the jungle is disappearing at a very rapid rate. But there's another thing going on there, which is industrialized agriculture. So there's a company called Plantar in Brazil. Plantar bought 57,000 acres of rainforest. They clear-cut it, having the usual catastrophic effects on the flora, fauna, and the neighboring people. And they planted it into a monoculture of eucalyptus trees. Now, why would they do that? Well, because there is nearby a low-grade iron ore smelting plant which uses coal. So they're getting credits for having destroyed the rainforest, planted eucalyptus trees, because the eucalyptus trees are going to be used to produce charcoal, which will be used to smelt the iron ore. This is another offset. I would argue we've just lost 57,000 acres of rainforest. These people are, not providing a net benefit. So I'm very skeptical that this is somehow going to be the salvation of those forests. In the U.S., the Waxman-Markey bill would allow our polluters basically to get 2 billion metric tons of offsets. That's about a third of what they have to, that we emit. That's about a third of our emissions. They can do it in offsets. There's a recent report from the Congressional Budget Office that says probably at least 60% of what they do to reduce carbon will be with offsets. So if the offsets aren't real, and they don't reduce their carbon emissions here, but they add costs because they had to buy these phony offsets, what are we getting here? Are we getting to our objective of stopping the emissions? No. There's one think tank that's some dispute, but they did an analysis of a Congressional Budget Office report, and they say because there's another unique feature of Markey-Waxman, we're giving away the allowances to the polluters. So they get them for free. President Obama originally said, no, they have to be sold. The Europeans said, gee, we made a big mistake. We gave them away. We shouldn't have done that. We should have sold them. Well, Markey-Waxman gives, because that's the deal they had to cut to move this bill as it got worse and worse, they're going to give the polluters these allowances. But they came up with another great idea. You don't have to use them. You can save them forever. So if it's cheaper to go overseas and buy an offset and keep polluting here, do that. Meanwhile, put your allowances in the bank. And then if overseas the offsets go up in price a little bit, well, then pull your allowances out and keep polluting. This think tank called Breakthrough says that a combination of the bankables, allowances, and the offsets could lead us to a 0.5% emission reduction by 2020 in the U.S. in capped industries. Now, you might quibble with their analysis, but you can see how this can be gamed. That's very much a problem. Then there's the problem of the potential carbon bubble itself. In Europe, they have already developed carbon futures, carbon offset futures, carbon derivatives, and they are now slicing and dicing them into special investment vehicles with tranches of carbon. They have names for it: gourmet carbon, junk carbon. And they put them together. Now, does this sound like something we're all kind of familiar with here? To have something to do with mortgages in the United States of America? But they're going to do it with carbon, and they think it's going to be a much bigger market than was the mortgage market here in the United States of America. In the back of the room, I have a copy of a report from someone who's an outlier like me, Friends of the Earth, a well-regarded environmental group, except by some of their colleagues right now. who put out a report called Subprime Carbon. Makes very interesting reading. I recommend it to you. You can pick up a copy on the way out, or you can visit it on my website. Okay, what's my alternative? You shouldn't complain about something unless you've got an alternative. Well, I've got an alternative. It's kind of out of fashion, but one more digression. The Obama administration has actually begun to regulate carbon. We had a Supreme Court decision. The Bush administration wouldn't implement it. The Obama administration, EPA, has filed notice they are going to regulate carbon emissions in the public interest, and they have begun a regulatory process. The Markey-Waxman bill would prohibit the EPA from going forward with its regulatory approach, and would put all our eggs into the market-based approach that they're proposing. So we couldn't have the regulatory approach. But wait, it's going to get more ironic. If you're going to have a market-based approach and you're going to cap people, then you have to know what they're emitting. Okay, guess what? We're going to send out the government regulators. They're going to have to inventory all the sources. They're going to then have to give people caps. They're going to have to set up a monitoring mechanism. Couldn't we just then regulate them? Well, no, we're going to then put the market system on top of the regulatory structure and say, well, the market system is going to control this. And by the way, you can pierce your caps if you do it through a market-based system. But they claim, well, the market-based system will make this more efficient, effective, or as the Oregonian said, many economists agree this will be less expensive. How is it less expensive? You can have a direct system with certainty where people can look out 20 years and say, oh, I can make an investment. I know it's going to pencil out because 20 years I can only emit this much carbon. Under the cap and trade market-based system, carbon has gone from $30 a ton to $1 a ton in Europe, and now it's trading somewhere around $8. So if you invested in technology last year at $15 a ton, you're probably broken out of business. If you're a utility and you want to plan for the future, you've got no certainty. You don't know what's going to happen in this market. Met with the head of one of America's largest utility, works for Warren Buffett, Mid-America. He says, give me a cap. Give me a cap. Give me a plan. He says, I might build nukes and you might not like it. He says, but I'll meet the demand. I will meet that schedule. I can do it. He said, but don't trade. I mean, Warren Buffett has been one of the leaders against derivatives and all these bizarre financial instruments for years. He says, you don't know what you're going to create here. There'll be no certainty for anybody, and there's the potential for an unbelievable bubble and collapse in the future. So I'm a co-sponsor of a bill written by Jim McDermott from Washington State, which gets very little attention. It's very simple. It's based on the Clean Water Act. We're going to go out and inventory all the sources. We're going to cap them. We're going to give everybody a schedule to reduce. We're going to say, by the way, you've got to pay for your permit, and we can raise a fair amount of money that way. And if you don't meet the schedule, just like under the Clean Water Act, we're going to fine the heck out of you. I mean, in the Clean Water Act, you can be fined up to $50,000 a day. That's a pretty good stick. Most people tend to comply to avoid that. So, then people say, well, no, wait a minute, this is way too complicated. There's so much of it out there, it's way too complicated. Well, actually, the Clean Water Act regulates 500,000 sources. 50,000 of them are major sources. The others are more minor. The Clean Air Act regulates 250 million sources, 84,000 of them major industries and 2,000 power plants. And Markey-Waxman would regulate 7,400 entities. But somehow we couldn't do that through a regulatory approach, even though it's much bigger in terms of the Clean Air Act or much bigger in terms of the Clean Water Act. That's not a viable argument as to why we can't go in that direction. So I prefer the McDermott approach for the certainty, the fact that we will really reduce emissions here in the United States of America. We won't be engaged in buying phony offsets offshores. We won't create new exotic, credit default swaps and all sorts of subprime carbon trading and tranches of carbon and all those other crazy things. But we have an unholy alliance here of Wall Street, big business, and some major environmental groups. Does that sound familiar? That's the same group of people who supported energy deregulation 12 years ago. They were wrong then, and they're way worse wrong this time, and it could be much more catastrophic for our economy. And let me just end. Even if this bill passes, and even if it passes the Senate, even more doubtful, it doesn't envision beginning to be implemented until 2012. I don't think we should wait. And unfortunately, all our energy is diverted into this debate over cap and trade instead of real steps we can and should take. The United States of America as a country should adopt the same renewable portfolio standards that we have here in Oregon. They're trading away real gains for the American people, that is a high renewable portfolio standard in this bill, in order to get votes. They're lowering and lowering and lowering that standard. We'll be lucky if we end up with 17 or 16% or 15% nationally. We have 25% in Oregon. The country could get there. That would spur a huge investment in new technologies, a huge growth in green jobs, make us less dependent on foreign sources of oil, and do something real about our carbon footprint. So that's one thing we do. We could, now that we own the auto companies, or some of them, we could have a really tough, CAFE standard and say, look, we're in charge now. You can't lobby against us anymore, and we're going to have a really tough CAFE standard. We could have a major, national program to invest in renewable technologies and much more efficient biofuels, not ethanol, which is a loser, but looking toward the next generation of biodiesel fuels that could have net energy gains and burn much cleaner. And then finally, what I'm working on full-time is delivering us, about a third of our carbon emissions are mobile sources. So what I want to do is get the American people out of congestion and traffic and snarls. We waste 4 billion gallons of gasoline and diesel fuel a year is burned by people sitting in traffic. If we could eliminate half of that, that would be an incredible contribution to reducing our greenhouse gases. People have, it's estimated, it was about $80 billion cost to Americans and businesses last year because of sitting in congestion. Our road surfaces are rated very poorly. We have 160,000 bridges that are either structurally obsolete or they are actually load limited and have to be replaced on the national system. So we have huge legacy costs and maintenance. The city of Chicago alone, I always use that example to try and get the president's attention, has $6 billion in deferred maintenance on their transit system. Some of the trains have to run at 2 miles per hour over tracks that are propped up with 2x4s. I'm glad they're using wood products, but it's probably not great, especially if we're going to host the Olympics there. So we need to be making these investments. We need a transformative transportation bill, one that puts us on a path to reducing emissions, reducing congestion, giving people more transit options, more fuel-efficient options, incorporates the kind of planning we've done here in Oregon into a national model. We can do all those things, and all those things are embodied in the bill that I've been working with Chairman Oberstar on now for 2.5 years, and I hope to pass that bill out of my subcommittee next Wednesday and begin to contribute something very real to the quality of life for all Americans and a real contribution toward lowering our greenhouse gas footprint. With that, thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.
The first question of our speaker, as always, will be from our Board of Governors host. Our board host today is Tom Iverson. Tom Iverson is the Fish and Wildlife Program Coordinator for the Columbia Basin Fish and Wildlife Authority. Tom has been a member of City Club since 2004, served on 2 ballot measure study committees, is the incoming chair of the research board of the club, became a member of the Board of Governors last year. Tom?
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Congressman. My question is, you sort of use the Clean Water Act as your example of regulatory enforcement to move forward in regulating greenhouse gases. One could argue that it's taken 30 years of lawsuits to actually get the teeth into the Clean Water Act so that it has now become sort of an effective legislation. I think in the fisheries community, one of the comments we often say is that if the Clean Water Act was enforced, we wouldn't have needed the Endangered Species Act. And so moving forward with the regulation you propose, do you believe that we have the capacity, capability to enforce new legislation on greenhouse gases with the intensive lobbyists that we have in our legislative branch and the link between industry and regulatory agencies that we see so common now in our government?
Well, as I said, underlaying cap and trade is a regulatory structure. It's going to have to be robust. We're going to have to monitor them on a daily basis, hourly basis, however that's going to be done. So you have to build the regulatory structure, or cap and trade won't work. Otherwise, it would be a faith-based cap and trade, which maybe the last administration would have done. I don't think this one will go there. So there's that. And then, I mean, is the alternative to involve the markets? Would we want to have people trading pollution permits on the Willamette River? And they'd say, well, geez, I'm sorry, we can dump into the Willamette with our point source pollution here. We bought an offset in Brazil. That's what we're dealing with here. So, yes, I believe we can establish a regulatory structure that will be enforceable, and the courts have ruled the EPA can move ahead with that.
Okay, we'll now take questions from the floor. Asking questions at Friday Forum is the privilege of City Club membership, so please state your name and your club membership. Please try to keep your question 30 seconds or less and pose a question as opposed to making a speech. We'll end at 1:15. Thank you.
Chris Allman, City Club member. I deeply appreciate your concerns about the market-based approach. The Waxman-Markey bill, also in talking about the renewable portfolio standards, introduces the concepts of multipliers for renewable energy certificates. This is very relevant in that at this very moment right now in committee, a joint committee down in Salem is discussing a bill for a feed-in tariff which also has a utility-scale solar component. And the utilities are wanting 2-for-1 multipliers for the renewable energy certificates. Can you comment on whether or not you agree that this is a good policy and what you think we should do instead of multipliers if you don't think they're good?
So you're saying that basically their allowances, they get a multiplier for their allowance because of
cost, yeah.
Right.
So solar, because it's more expensive, rather than being one renewable energy certificate that goes for the renewable portfolio standard will be worth 2.
Right. Well, of course, nuclear gets 50% too, and that's beyond me why that's included. But I think a more straightforward approach and the way we have encouraged solar development in this country is through tax credits and investment, rather than engaging in some new scheme. I believe, now obviously there is a problem when it comes to public utilities, if you want to get them to make those sorts of investments because they can't benefit as much from the tax credits. But you could allow what are called tradable tax credits, where you're going to build a project, and if you were a private entity, you would have gotten this much of a tax credit. Since you're public, that you could dispose of that and get some value for it. But I just really anything that's that working off the allowance system, and then those allowances would be doubled, and then they'd be tradable and bankable. It seems very problematic to me.
Lee Stevenson Kuhn, City Club member. I'm also a member of a committee studying the issue of transportation governance in the Portland metropolitan area. When we look at population density, we find that the dense population not only is in 3 counties on the Oregon side, but also laps over into Clark County. And so we have an Oregon-Washington metropolitan area. And when you look at federal funding, and leave aside what goes directly to TriMet, you have 2 streams of money. And one goes to the Oregon Department of Transportation, the other goes to the Washington Department of Transportation, whose primary focus is on interstate highway systems. Question: if we make a change and develop a single regional transportation governance entity, what is the likelihood of that happening, and what are the issues that would be involved in having federal money directed to that entity rather than to the 2 separate departments of transportation?
Okay. Thanks. Good question. Actually, there's a title in our bill which is called the Metropolitan Mobility Section, and it would break through the old model of, you've got, you have all these stovepipes of money coming down to different entities in different ways. 106 programs, the Department of Transportation give more flexibility. And we would require metropolitan areas of more than 1 million to develop metropolitan mobility plans to deal with a number of problems which we're going to lay out, which go to the issues of congestion, pollution, all of those things, safety, accessibility, and also, transit and transportation alternatives to single occupancy vehicles. And we are then, once they have a plan, they'll submit it to the Secretary of Transportation. And if that plan is approved, they will be eligible for special funds that would be metropolitan-wide, outside the control. Now, this is a little controversial. There's probably someone here from ODOT. I don't know if they know about this, but outside the control of ODOT. I mean, ODOT would still be consulted with, but they would not control that money. And it would be spent for projects that would have benchmarks within that metropolitan area to address those national priorities for our congested metropolitan areas, which I think would resolve a lot of the problems and issues you have. There would still be separate money flowing to the states for highway programs, so the states we would also give rural areas a little more clout in dealing with the state DOTs in terms of some potential. We want to have a rural transit title too, something we really don't have now. It's an afterthought in the bill, and in addition to dealing with disability services accessibility. We'll have we've got an 80-page description of the bill up online now, and we'll have a draft of the bill up online probably Monday, and be happy to hear your comments on it. We're also going to do a little bit of MPO reform in there, which I think will also be a little bit controversial. So, yeah.
Dr. Jim Scott, City Club member. You've made some convincing comments about the challenges of the market in the area of energy, and there's another major industry where the market has been, I would say, an abject failure over the last decades, and that's healthcare. Yet, most of the proposals that are out there today are relying on a market-based approach of competition among notably insurance companies. It would seem to me that based on the evidence nationally and internationally for a sound policy around a single-payer system, that a progressive like yourself would have signed on to H.R. 676 supporting a single-payer system for this country. Can you explain your logic in not supporting that bill?
Sure, I've read it. Most people haven't. John's a wonderful guy. He's chairman of the Judiciary Committee. He's a member of the Progressive Caucus with me. And John wrote that bill when the Republicans controlled everything, and it was to engender a discussion. It's not really any sort of a blueprint. It does not show how we would move, how we would transition from a system where 160 million people get their health insurance now privately or through their employer, and the different systems we have, and how you would mesh the VA and how you would mesh Medicare and how you would assure the 160 million people who have private health insurance that they weren't going to be harmed in this process, and how you're going to make the transition and how you're going to pay for it. None of that's in the bill. It does set out sort of a goal, and I share the goal, which is everybody in America should have access to affordable health care. Everybody should. And President Obama, I believe, shares that goal. And, as he said, if he were starting a new country today, he'd have a single-payer system. But he's not. He's inherited what we've got, and he's trying to make it work. And that's where he came up with the idea of the public plan, which has become hugely controversial. The Senate's dragging its feet on the public plan. This insurance industry is saying, oh, my God, if you have a public plan and it's good and it's less expensive, people will gravitate there, and then we'll have single payer someday. Well, the studies show that probably won't happen. But if we evolved there instead of mandating some sort of transition, that wouldn't be bad either, would it? I'm strongly supportive of the president's position. We're trying to hold the line in the House on a public plan. We're having problems with the blue dog Democrats. The Senate really seems to be moving away from it. But Speaker Pelosi's been very emphatic about that. The other thing is, you used a word at the beginning, which some people still don't know. There is no competition in insurance in America. There is no competition. They are exempt from antitrust law. And I've had a bill for 23 years to subject the insurance industry to antitrust law. Consumers Union says that wouldn't only save us money in health care and health insurance, it would save us money on our car insurance, our homeowners insurance, our liability insurance, everything else we buy, because it's an anti-competitive, collusive industry. That's also a good place to start in this. And the president did mention that once during the campaign. I'm trying to inject that into the debate now. Challenge the insurance industry both with a public plan option and by taking away their antitrust immunity and making them really compete.
Congressman DeFazio, I'm Joyce DeMonin, City Club member. Thank you very much for your comments today. I enjoyed them very much, but I'm also interested in health care. What chance do you think we have to really get meaningful health care reform this summer? I know the president wants to have a bill on his desk this fall. And also, do you have any recommendations on how to lower the costs of prescription drugs, which is skyrocketing at much higher the rate of medical inflation generally, which is skyrocketing above the consumer price index?
Well, prescription drugs is simple. We just do what every other industrial democracy on earth does. The government would negotiate with the pharmaceutical industry for the lowest cost, and they would make that available to all their citizens, whether you're insured or uninsured, and your insurance company could buy it at that price too. It's just what we do with the VA now. We cut a pretty good deal. It's what the private insurance companies do now. The so-called prescription drug plan that was passed by the Republicans actually prohibited the government from negotiating lower prices with the industry, and also required that the plans all be relatively small so they couldn't get pricing power against the industry. And it's a very expensive $1 trillion plan because it's very expensive to subsidize the pharmaceutical and insurance industries, which is what we did. So I would throw that thing out, go back, and then give seniors a meaningful and very inexpensive prescription drug benefit after the government has negotiated the price down like we've done for the VA. Will we get health reform this summer? It has shades of, I was there in 92, 93, I guess, when we did the Clinton attempt on the Clinton health care, and we were going to do it by the August break. It's going to be tough. The Senate is proving, as usual, to be particularly problematic. My colleagues were to unveil a much more detailed outline of our proposal today. I don't know if that happened since I've been on the plane at 6 o'clock this morning, but we're determined, the Speaker's determined, and we do have rules in the House, and she's saying she's going to move us through this bill by the end of July, although depending on the cost estimate we get from CBO, there's going to be a revenue issue, which is a big hang-up in the Senate. And then secondly, we got to deal with the 40 blue dog Democrats because we're probably not going to get a lot of Republican votes. Remember, Medicare was passed without a single Republican vote. So we don't I want them to participate, but if they don't want to, that's fine. We recognize the problem and we'll take care of it, and they'll probably take credit for it later if we do a good job. So.
Hi, Congressman. Alex Tinker, City Club member. The Waxman-Markey bill, even in its current severely weakened form, is going to face a really tough time passing the House. What do you think the chances are for the passage of McDermott's regulatory bill, or even Congressman Larson's carbon tax bill, or even Republican Bob Inglis's revenue-neutral carbon tax bill this year? And how important is it to the success of international climate treaty negotiations that the United States pass something soon?
Well, that's sort of the whole premise is Bush gave us such a black eye that Obama, being the first president since, I believe, the first Bush to go to a climate change conference, has to go there with something. Well, what he can go there with is pretty darn strong. The Supreme Court of the land of the United States of America has determined that our existing regulatory agency, who's in charge of clean air and clean water, the Environmental Protection Agency, can regulate carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, and they have begun a process. That's a pretty darn strong position for the president to go there with. And then we could also, then not being diverted by cap and trade and all of its 1,000 pages of peculiarities, just get back and focus on renewable portfolio standards, alternative energy, my transportation policies, and other things that would deliver real benefits. He could go there, I think, with his head held very high, showing that times have changed and America is a leader. I'm worried that we're headed down the wrong path here. And then people say, well, he said cap and trade during the campaign. I said, well, he acknowledged the problem, which the last president didn't, and he wants to do something about it. If we encourage him to do it in a different way, I'm sure, he's a little bit flexible. He might figure it out. So.
Steve Novick, City Club member. Congressman, as a former federal environmental law enforcer, I appreciate your appreciation of regulation. And when it comes to the electric utilities, I can see how a hard cap works. They have to go out and encourage conservation or buy renewables. On transportation, I'm not sure who the cap even applies to, the car companies, the oil companies, the individual driver. And I wonder if on transportation, perhaps one option is to do what the Clean Air Act does, which is to give the states targets for emissions reductions to meet, and then experiment with their own different regulatory schemes in order to address that.
Have you been reading our bill? We actually have a provision in the bill that the Department of Transportation, in consultation with the Environmental Protection Agency, would set state-by-state standards for carbon emission reductions of mobile sources, and then we would have measurable benchmarks. The Waxman-Markey bill doesn't deal with mobile sources, except to say the EPA should come up with regulations to deal with mobile sources, which would be, tailpipe standards or movement away from fossil fuel-fired vehicles, and however we're going to do that. I think we're pretty much in sync on that, Steve. But you should look at that section of our bill and see if you think it works, and or maybe we could improve it. So, thanks.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. We obviously need very seriously transportation alternatives to the automobile, particularly in the cities. And one of the problems with funding public transportation is the inherent bias between capital projects and operating assistance. There is a tendency to go into a very expensive capital project because, on the other hand, one would need actually more service on the street because that's what would provide more ridership. So I think there should be a correction there. The federal assistance should be for both, for capital and operating, but it should be under strict guidelines in order to make sure that the final result is an increase in ridership, because that's what it's all about. What do you think about this bias?
Thank you. No. Well, there's a number of issues there. The Federal Transit Administration is pretty dysfunctional. And until East Side Portland, we hadn't ever managed to get a streetcar project approved or through their process because of the arcane black box formula they used called T-sub, which always came up, it was written by the Bush administration, always came up with the conclusion that a bus is better than a fixed guideway, which I think had something to do with the fact that the Bush administration didn't want to build, fixed guideway transportation, because then you have an enduring legacy that we're going to have to maintain, and it's going to transport people for the next 100, 200 years, like some of our existing systems. We're getting rid of that whole formula. We're moving toward measures for transit that are going to deal with with livability. They are going to deal with ridership, which the current formula actually doesn't do. In terms of their cost-benefit analysis, we're going to fix a lot of the problems that exist. We figure that we can change the Department of Transportation, the FTA, to the point where instead of taking 14 years for a transit project, we can deliver 1 in 3. And really benefit the American people and get these things going quicker. We're very much in the middle of a debate over capital and operating assistance. I tried to offer an operating assistance amendment to the so-called stimulus bill. It wasn't allowed. But we just, in the recently passed supplemental, we built in some flexibility for some transfers between operating and between capital and operating. We have huge capital deficiencies in the legacy systems, the older ones. They need to be dealt with. They can't be ignored. But it doesn't make much sense to be fixing the system when you're shutting down routes and denying people access to the system. So we need both, and you're right, and we're still working on this part. How are you going to do that on an ongoing basis? And we're looking at doing it through measures in terms of the amount of state of good repair they have for their existing system. If they have one that's deteriorated, they have to have a plan to bring it up. And then they can show, if they do that, they can split their money between operating in capital as long as they stay on the glide path to meet that plan. So we're going to try and give them new flexibility, but it's a very real problem.
And I guess the final result, ridership, that's very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually going to be now a factor that we count heavily as opposed to the T-sub formula, which didn't exactly, it's too complicated to explain. Anyway.
Steve Shell, member. I admire your facility to go back and forth between these issues. Your comments on
foreign affairs too. Come on,
that's the City Club, right? Back to the cap and trade. You know, the arguments you make are very succinct and worthwhile. The difficulty is it a Don Quixote type argument? Markey, Waxman passed 3325 out of the committee. Apparently there's a compromise made this week with regard to the Agricultural Committee and what's going on in the Midwest. It looks like there's movement behind this next week. Who knows what happens in the Senate? It's been very hard, as I've watched the processes, to get things out of committee and get them moving in this. Are you Don Quixote, or is there a political way to obtain your goal of a Clean Water Act type analogy?
Sure, all I have to do is kill the bill. Because remember, this bill would prohibit the EPA from going forward and developing regulations to deal with greenhouse gases. In the case of the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, we had to establish an environmental protection agency and we had to give them the authority. In this case, a court has ruled the EPA already has that authority. The Obama administration has given notice. They've filed a general certificate of, I can't remember what it's called. Anyway, they're saying this is a national health issue. And that they're asking for comments on that. Once they promulgate that rule, they can regulate. So if Markey Waxman doesn't pass, I am going to urge, and I'm supposed to meet with Carol Browner next week, who's the President's Special Environmental Advisor, keep pushing the EPA to move forward and adopt meaningful regulations, because that may be where we end up as a fallback, and that wouldn't be all bad, in my opinion.
Kurt Webring, member. What's the status of mile per gallon vehicle mile per gallon requirements on new vehicles? And the other question I have, quick one, is there's a gas guzzler buyout program, and what happens to the purchased gas guzzlers? Do they get shipped to developing countries?
No, we're not that bad. Although the Chinese did buy H2, so they're going to be producing Hummers. But the CAFE standards were increased by Congress this last year for the first time. And I don't even know, in many years. We had been stonewalled by John Dingell and Detroit for many years with, again, a not very good alignment. I'm very sympathetic. The unions work closely with them, and they'd come in and say, oh, we just got to, you can't do this. And I say, no, I think actually if we do this, you'll be building cars that are just more efficient. You'll still be building cars. Unfortunately, you know, we went down the wrong path, and we've lost a lot of our companies. So we had the increase. It was modest. It did not, I was a sponsor of, in the last Congress, I'm not sure if it's been reintroduced, a bill based on the study by the National Academy of Sciences on the mileage, the mileage savings and CAFE standards we can reach, which would be about 10 miles more per gallon than we legislated last year within 15 years with known existing technologies. So we could have done much better, and that would be something I'd like to revisit again. If we see this cap and trade bill fail, we can turn our efforts toward another step on CAFE, or now that we own the companies, we can just impose it on them, I guess. Although we're not going to do that, the president says, but I don't know. Clunkers, cash for clunkers. The transmissions and engines have to come out and be destroyed and recycled. So they're not going to be shipped overseas to cause the pollution over there. So I think I'm getting the hook. Thank you very much. I appreciate your great audience.
For any of your City Club members who want to go to the annual meeting on Tuesday, make sure you sign up this afternoon. Next week, it'll be Attorney General John Kroger. And please help me thank our 4th District Congressman for a very intriguing presentation. We're adjourned.